My kudu they called him the ghost. He had a broken off horn on the left side, and his right side was non-typical. And they said 3 other bow hunters had put arrows into him, and nobody had ever found him after they put an arrow in him. So in Africa, if you draw blood, you pay for the animal.
Right.
So he had been paid for 3 times. And we saw him out when we were out driving, and we saw him, and I told Marco, I'll shoot him. And Marco said, he is the ghost. Longbow, no take the ghost. And I said, if you put me somewhere where I can put an arrow in him, I'll shoot him.
Well, it's got to be even more tempting because now he's the ghost. You got to get the ghost.
Yeah, and they figured he was 12 years old. And he always traveled with a stud kudu. I mean, 3 full curls, which is unheard of in a kudu. And those 2 always traveled together. And he said, I will put you where ghost is. But he said, you will shoot the other kudu. I said, nope, I will not. I will shoot the ghost. So he put me in a tree stand, which is a whole other story. He put me in a tree stand, and those 2 kudu came in together. And I sat there and I looked at that 3 curl kudu, and I thought, God, he would make a beautiful mount. Because the other one was beat up, scarred. But I said I'd shoot the ghost, so I'm shooting the ghost. So I drew back and shot, and I shot what to this day I will tell you was the perfect shot. I tucked it right behind his front leg, coming out of that tree stand. Arrow was sticking out. He ran about 100 yards and just stood there with the arrow sticking out of him. And he was looking back at the arrow and looking up at me. And he just stood there. And I thought, okay, he's going to go down right there. And he stood there and he stood there, and then he reached his horn back and he snapped that arrow off.
What?
And then he just walked off.
What?
And I went, there's no way. So I called Marco on the radio and I said, I just shot the ghost. He said, you shot or you killed? I said, I just put an arrow in the ghost.
He knows.
And he goes, he said, killed ghost. I said, I shot him. And I know it's a good arrow, Marco. I know it's a good arrow. He said, okay, I come. And he come and he brought all the trackers and everything. And I showed him where he was, and he found my arrow, and there was not a drop of blood on the ground anywhere.
This is crazy. What? How's that possible?
Those trackers are so incredible. They got on his footprints, and they knew his footprints, and they followed him. And this was at 9 o'clock in the morning when I shot him, and we tracked him until 5 o'clock at night.
How is that possible?
And the one tracker that was the head tracker, they called him Slowy. He was old guy. And I figured, yep, I just paid for the ghost again. I'm done. And Slowy looked at me and he said, Buana, you killed him. We look one more time. Buana. I find your kudu. The ghost is here. And I said, okay, Slowy, I'll take your word for it. He said, we pushed through here. They put Marco at the end with a rifle. And he said, ghost in here. We pushed this out. Marco, get the ghost for you. I said, okay. So I went with the trackers and we walked through, and we were about halfway through, and I heard a gunshot. And I went, we did it. And I came running out, and Marco was standing there, and he said, he's still alive.
Oh, what?
And I said, how? And he said, I just saw him running. He said, I tried to run and shot, and I completely missed him. And he said, I saw him run off, and he went down into those trees. He said, you didn't get him, Vince. I'm sorry. He's still alive. And all of a sudden, because the trackers all took off running, and they're pretty much, for the most part, young men. They took off running, and all of a sudden they started yelling and hollering in Afrikaans. And I looked at Marco, and Marco said, run! So I took off running with Marco as hard as I could, and we ran down to that stand of trees, and the ghost was just standing there looking at everybody. Wouldn't leave, was just standing there.
This is amazing.
And Marco said, shoot him again. So I pulled an arrow out, and I drew back, and I let go, and that arrow went through that kudu so fast. I mean, right through him. Never even slowed down. Right through him. And he just looked at me. And I looked at Marco, and Marco said, shoot him again.
What the hell?
So I drew back, let another arrow go, went right through him. Right through the chest. I picked a spot, went right through the chest, and he just stared at me. And then all of a sudden, his front legs gave out, and he fell face first into the dirt. And I said, thank God I got him. And then he stood back up. And he looked at me, and Marco said, shoot him again. And I pulled out the last arrow out of my quiver, drew back, shot, put it right through his chest. So I've got 4 arrows through him now. And he stood there, and then his back legs went down. And he looked around. He was kind of sitting on his haunches, looking around. Then he stood back up, and he was going to run away. And Marco said, shoot them again. And I said, I'm out of arrows. I have no more arrows. And he looked at me, he said, do you want me to shoot him with gun? And I said, no, I want to kill him with a bow. So he sent one of the trackers digging through the grass because it wouldn't leave. It just stood there. He found one of my arrows and threw them back over the top of the kudu to me. And I drew back and shot, and that final arrow, when the arrow went through him, he fell face first into the ground and tipped over. And then It was like a huge party. They just went nuts when the ghost died. When we gutted him, every arrow went through his lungs.
Was there scar tissue from other shots too?
Yep.
This is insane.
That's why they called him. And Marco looked at me when we opened him up. Marco looked at me, and he was pointing out my arrow holes in him. And then the first arrow was buried in his off shoulder. It had gone right over the top of his heart and buried in the broadhead was in his off shoulder. And Marco said, Africa, not like you American animals.